Well, welcome back, everybody. My name's Evan.
And I'm Andrew.
And we're so glad that you've joined us back on the BCC Pod. This is a podcast where we take what's happening in our church and what we're learning together on weekends and bring it into unscripted conversations that dive a little bit deeper. Whether you're tuning in on your drive, whether you're at the gym or you're just relaxing at home, we're so glad that you're here. So this past weekend, we were in week 2 of Deadly Desires, talking about the 7 deadly sins. And this one was all about greed. Do you want to summarize your sermon in 4 words?
Sure. Greed's bad. Generosity's good.
I don't even remember the line you said last week that I said you couldn't reuse, but I'm like, there's so many ways to change it like that.
Yeah,
like,
just to make it, yeah.
It's like, I had written some down too, and I'm like, no, those are basically just versions of what we said last week. Why don't you give a little bit of a rundown, just kind of the kind of main point and challenge of your sermon and kind of what you were getting at.
Sure. So my main point was really that greed really steals life from you, that it's not a healthy thing. It's not a good thing. And that greed is really the love of material things or material possessions, or specifically the love of money, like too much. Like, it's not bad or wrong to have money. It's when you all of a sudden it occupies too much wanting in your heart, then that's where it goes sideways. And then what I want to encourage people was towards the opposite of it, which was generosity, to actually live with generosity, to actually make it even into a habit, to make sure that it happens consistently, and to just live with generosity. That generosity gives life, but greed really, it steals like life from you, and those from around you, because nobody wants to be around somebody who's like greedy or closed off or unwilling to share anything.
Yeah.
Those just aren't healthy traits at all.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. I always appreciate, because we've, I think a couple of years back, maybe like, actually, it's not a couple of years back anymore. I think it was like 2018 we did 7 Deadly Sins. So it's been like 8 years or so.
Yeah.
About as many years as there are sins, and, or at least deadly ones. And I always appreciate the reminder that, like, for something as, I think, normalized in different ways in our culture as greed, I think it's a good reminder for people of the consuming nature of it. Because I think sometimes, like I think we'll find with all of these, they're kind of, there's a more sneaky or insidious tone to them that I think sometimes they can show up in our lives in ways that we didn't think they would, or didn't prepare for, or like didn't catch, right? And they can kind of become blind spots. And I think greed is an especially unique one in that sense, that I think oftentimes there's like there can be like blatant greed, but oftentimes greed can just like lie under the surface a little bit, and can often be something that informs your decisions rather than just something that you do, if that makes sense. Like that, I think making decisions or choosing to do things out of a place of greed or out of a place of like scarcity mindset or things like that is a lot more common than like pointing out like, oh, what I just did was super greedy and blatant.
I think I mentioned this in the first service, but you might not realize this, but sometimes the first service and second service sometimes can actually be different. But in the first service, how I shared a little bit around how greed can be sneaky and how it can hide in even things like even like pretend wisdom, as if, oh, I should have some more because that'll make it better or safer, or in ambition or something like that. Yeah. Where sometimes the drive for more is like an ambition isn't necessarily wrong or a sin, but it can be kind of hidden in there. Greed can be with a drive for more and more and more. And it can be really sneaky, hiding in things without seeing sometimes how it's consuming and shifting the lenses of things. Yeah.
Was there anything this past weekend that you didn't get to that you wanted to? Was anything kind of cut for time?
Nothing this week was kind of cut for time. Just I felt like with this sermon that most of the people will be on board that greed is bad. Like, I don't think many people are going to be like, I don't know, if it, as if it's healthy in anything. So it's just more wanting to share with people that, how it's a consuming nature of things, and to get them even to do a little bit of a heart check with it. Like that's even why I shared that story about that funny thing about me and Krista going out on a date or whatever, and just realizing that there was greed that was hiding in there somehow. Like, my gut reaction when someone asked me for support or some help was just no. And I'm like, why is that there? That shouldn't be there. There should be something else. So yeah, that's kind of what I was just hoping to get across for people.
It struck me as I was listening to you talk how, and this is probably just how my brain works, when you were sharing the story about you at the Leafs game and the encounter you had, that there is with like kind of tackling greed and the call of Jesus on our lives, and specifically Jesus' care for the poor and care for kind of the lowly, and our call to do the same, that those things can go hand in hand. That I think like greed, not only greed in our own lives and just being generous in interactions like that, but also like there's a systemic aspect to greed as well. That like in societal systems and structures that are predicated on greed and hoarding of wealth, and just like you said, like sometimes in a righteous way of like a building generational wealth, or like getting as much profit as you can, or all that sort of thing, that does disproportionately affect the poor. And the outcome is disproportionately lands on their shoulders. And I just like that connection to me, I think is important too, that like that greed can affect, that there's a societal aspect to greed and the like our systems and structures, and there's personal greed as well. And that like working to rid both of those things and doing what we can is a holy work, I think.
Yeah. Well, even, and I didn't get into this, and the sermon wasn't quite on this, but today I was teaching at our Accelerate kind of group, which was great. And I was teaching on the 3 different levels of sin, how there's personal sin, which is really what the sermon kind of focused on. But then there's also like what's called corporate or collective sin. And that greed is really a part of, I think, of our societal kind of sin. It is really a part of our systems and a part of so much of what we do. And then there's a 3rd level of sin, which we sometimes call like cosmic or universal, which I preached on before, where sin is like a power that you have to defeat. But I think there was a lot that we could have shared around about greed being a real corporate or collective sin of our culture, one that's just based on consumption and more and more and more, and how it doesn't lead to life.
I think about just like the normalized greed we have as a result of capitalism and as a result of the system that we're in, right? That like the idea of like, even just like American dream, North American dream vibe, right, is often tied to a growing amount of wealth. And the more that the better off you are, the more your American dream has been realized, which really just means the more wealth you can amass, the more that North American dream is realized, right? And like how much I don't even think about that when I think about like finances and stuff like that, of just how embedded those kinds of like values are in us, of like what is successful and what's not successful. And like,
and even like success in our culture is so often seen as always up and to the right, like more money, more wealth, more like mobility, all that kind of stuff, right? And you're like, I don't know if that's really the gospel's dream of what life really looks like. Right? Like always up and to the right and always more wealthy and all that sort of thing. I don't think so, but I think it's really like that quote I used from David Foster Wallace, where he says the sneaky part about these sins is that they set the default system for us, the default setting, like as if like as if we're a program, and that the default setting is definitely with our hearts tuned towards greed, which is not like good at all. Before we keep going, we did want to let you guys know about something that's coming up for our community. And we have something pretty sweet coming up, literally. You can mark your calendars for Sunday, April 6th at 5 p.m. because it's time for our Bethany Missions dessert auction. So this is something that we run yearly, and it's more than just a chance to satisfy your sweet tooth. It's an opportunity to support missions and the incredible missionaries we partner with. When you come to the missions potluck and dessert auction, you can expect bidding on some really great and awesome homemade desserts, with all the proceeds going directly to supporting Bethany Missions and identified needs. A potluck dinner that we can all share in, because good food always brings people together, and a little bit of a deeper look into Bethany Missions and how we are partnering with people who are serving around the globe. You'll hear stories, learn about the work that's being done, and find out how you can be a part of it as well. So definitely come ready to bid, eat, and connect. It's going to be a really, really great evening that you don't want to miss out on. So check the link in the bio.
and we'll see you there. All right. So we got some questions. I got a couple congregation questions, and then I threw in some for fun.
Oh, okay.
The first one came from a congregation member, longtime listener of the pod.
All 6 weeks of it.
Yeah. Hey, we crossed past 10, so now
Okay.
I feel like we can at least say it's like kind of a thing. You started with a quote at the start of your sermon, kind of defining greed.
Yep.
It said that greed is loving money and material possessions too much.
Yeah.
This question just asks, the simple question is like, how do we decide what is too much?
So the simple kind of answer, I actually think, is the true answer, is that needs to be brought forward like by God. Like, I think it's really hard to give a black and white kind of like measuring stick towards that. But I think by praying about it and asking God to say, hey, is this a part of it? I also think paying attention to your reactions is a way. That's even where I noticed like my gut reaction to that individual asking for support on Saturday night. Like my gut reaction was no. And I'm like, oh, that's not great either. And so I think one of the ways that you might notice it is through praying, through paying attention. And then the other thing is just to be noticing with whether or not you're actually generous, like paying attention for actions for the opposite too. That if generosity is a habit, then likely it's probably that greed isn't, because I don't think those two things can coexist well in the same space.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's a kind of a yardstick for saying, oh, this is all of a sudden too much. That there's probably some gray area in the middle where it's important to discern, to reflect, to pay attention to past actions, and then to pay attention to the future ones you are doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's probably mine.
I also think that like figuring that out and figuring out what that looks like for your own life really changes based on what your life looks like. That the ways that greed might pop up in your life can look different based on your socioeconomical status, where you live, your work, your life, like all sorts of different factors. And that, so there really is no kind of, as much as we'd love, right?
Yeah.
There was just an in and out, but
Oh,
it's going to look different. And I think in the same way too, that based on those things that change how greed looks, I think it also changes how generosity looks in your life as well.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, that it's not like generosity is not a one size fits all checkbox, right?
No.
That it's like both the practice and the posture of generosity in your life is going to look different depending on what your life looks like.
Yeah. Well, even in my one example of even the tithing, or my one kind of challenge to tithe, for someone, giving 10% might have actually become easy because it's been so habitual that they might need to actually sacrificially take another step again. For someone else who's maybe just starting like 2% or 5% might be incredible sacrificial giving on their part, right? So it depends on where you are. It depends really on what the Spirit is asking you to do. I think we can generalize and say like the Spirit's asking us to walk in generosity, but what does that look like? That's where you need the Holy Spirit's discernment and His direction, I think, to follow Him well and to make sure that greed doesn't get sneakily a part of our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah. Generosity looks different when you get season tickets to go see the Leafs. I don't know if you heard me. I was sitting on the side and Liam Jansen was near me. I think I was cracking him up because when you said that, I just yelled generational wealth.
I didn't hear you say that. I would have responded to it. But yeah, for sure.
The second question, how do we, and this kind of goes back to more some systemic greed, how do we operate ethically and in a Christ-like way in a system and society built on greed and the amassing and holding of wealth?
Yeah. So for this, what I'd like to say is I think the big thing is to pay attention and to not avoid some of the difficult things. What I think societal sin often wants us to do is to not pay attention to the ways that it's actually forming us. And so I think then we do pay attention. I think that's the whole point with it, to see it in our world, because it's hard to live in a world that is so predicated on greed without being caught up into it. So I would think like pay attention and don't turn away from maybe some of the difficult realities or even understandings we might need to kind of realize and then to act out of the right kind of discernment that God has for us.
Yeah. I think that's super good. And I think, normalization is the best thing for societal sin, right? That like, it just wants to be like, this is normal. This is just how it is. This is just the way things are, right? When it's actually something that we can work on and move away from. I think too, I heard a really good conversation on a different podcast recently where they were talking more out of a like social justice, like how do we engage in culture lens. But the one person had talked about the approach, because they started talking about this sort of like ethical living, and like it can be a bit of a like a hamster wheel sometimes, where it feels like to exist is to cause some form of death or decay in the world, right? And it's like I think there's a line question there of like how far do we go to rid ourselves of all these things that could be potentially harmful or could be feeding into greed or that sort of thing. And the person was saying that like what is less important to him is like whether you have a bamboo toothbrush or whether you look up where your investments are to see if they're like ethically invested. He's like that the specifics don't matter as much as the intent and the posture does. And that when we approach things like that in more of a way that says, I want to try and like get my own hands clean. Like I want to do this so that I feel like I've done enough and I feel like I'm kind of clean and washed of this, versus I'm going to do this because this is good for the flourishing of both me and the people around me. And those two are very different. And I think like when we talk about the conversation of greed and like how do we operate ethically and in a Christ-like way, I think that our intent matters in all of that, and saying like we're not trying to like do these things just so that like we feel good and we feel like we've done enough and we can like wash our hands of it, but that actually like these are things that if we believe the words of Christ, lead to flourishing in our lives and the lives of those around us.
Yeah, I really like that idea of it. Is it leading to flourishing? Because ultimately, following Christ, that is what it should lead to, flourishing for us and everyone around us.
Yeah.
And so I just think that that's a good idea, to pursue the flourishing of others and ourselves. And I like that idea.
Yeah. So how do we weigh out, and that we talked about this a little bit in the first question about how is too much. How do we weigh out or kind of delineate what's greeding versus what's wanting?
Oh, what do you think the difference is between those two?
Yeah. So I've been trying to think, because I wrote a note underneath here that just says wanting, needing, and greeding. And I didn't know if that was maybe a helpful framework. I think it's really easy to figure out needing versus wanting, right? Like the things that you need to live and the things that you want in your life. And I think it's worth saying too that like wanting and choosing to get things that you want is also not bad, right? But it comes back to this like consuming thing, and a thing of like abundance and excess, right? So like the difference, like in putting things into those categories of wanting, needing, and greeding, that might be a helpful lens, I think, just to say like, is this something that I'm just wanting in my life, or is this something that I actually already have enough of? And like just basically like adding some intention to what you're doing. Is this something I already have enough of? Is this something that I'm just doing because I want more, or because I think more is going to make me feel more secure in this moment, rather than just like, oh no, that's something I really want, and that's like something I don't have, or whatever it is, right? And I know we're talking about physical things too, but that applies to how you use your overflow money as well, right? Like what you do with with investments or things like that.
Sure.
And
I like those three categories. I might say the difference between wanting and greeding might be...
Great word, by the way.
I do. I said, like, as I said it, I'm like, I do like this word. It's a good one. It's a good one.
I didn't love how Google made me type it in 3 times because it kept editing it for me, but...
I like how in the English language you just make up more words. We have so many.
Yeah.
I think that the difference might be like wanting is where there is something that you might want. Greeding might be more where greed has a hold of your heart. Like what are you a slave to? And I think sometimes we all have wants, things that we desire, things that we hope for, things that we would love to experience or whatever. And those aren't wrong in any way. I think though all of a sudden though, the question is really around, are we a slave to that wanting? And if we are, then that's probably greeding. That's probably where I would put the difference between the two things.
Yeah. And I think in that case, it really just takes because I think sometimes like let's say it's like shopping unnecessarily, or it's like any sort of number of things. Like some of those things can become very habitual and then we don't realize them. So sometimes it can just be like putting a stop in that loop so that instead of it just continuing on, like you find ways to, in the moment, stop and actually just think and ask some of those questions. And you might end up saying like, oh no, this is something I want to go forward with, right? But that intention matters, because sometimes you'll be like, oh no, this is actually something I need to not do, or something I need to pivot from, or whatever. I got a question on tithing. How do we reconcile how tithing is practiced in the Bible versus how we call people to practice it today?
How do we reconcile the differences? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it definitely was very different in the Old Testament with it. I think the principle still, for me, the principle underlying is that we should be regularly, habitually giving and being generous people. And I think that's the principle that underlines what's going on within tithing in the Old Testament. So then we take that principle and we kind of bring it forward into the modern day and age and say, okay, so what does it look like then for me to be consistently generous, giving, and habitually doing that? And that's where then I came up with like tithing or just regular givers like here, or that there needs to be something that is continual going on for us to just make sure that greed doesn't get settled into our hearts or a space within our hearts. So I think, that's some of the difference, because it is we live in a very different world than the ancient Israelites certainly lived in Leviticus. Yeah.
It's it's funny. I think we talk about tithing so little now, or like the concept of it in those passages, that like I, even in some research for this pod, just brushed up on my tithing knowledge, and there were things that I'd forgotten about their whole like 7-year cycle and how they do things. Do you think for people who are wanting to tithe, do you think that is an exclusive to your home church thing, or not home church, like the church you attend that you're a member of, or do you think tithing is broader than that?
I think it's probably both and. I think it's important for, first of all, to be giving to the space where you are like contributing or walking or journeying with Jesus. Like if we're talking about church being kind of like a family in some ways, then it's just kind of like you contribute to your family, and that matters. But I don't think that then they should play off against one another. So I shouldn't be like, since I give here and tithe here, therefore I'm not going to give to that individual who came up and asked for money, because I'm giving here and that's the only exclusive place where I'm going to be giving. Right? All of a sudden that starts to be a little bit more hypocritical or legalistic with it. I also think the other thing is true too, that if all your giving isn't going that if none of your giving is coming to the space where you're journeying with, like as a church, that's also weird if it's going to all these other outside organizations. But I think in the Bible, when we start to talk about, especially in the New Testament, that our posture is supposed to be generosity. And so that should include our place of worship where we are going. And there will probably be other things that God's going to pull in our heart to say, hey, you should give to this. You should be committed to this too. And I think actually in the New Testament, we start to see tithing actually gets a little bit more, I would say, more difficult. That's not just like 10%. It's actually supposed to be progressive. We're probably supposed to continually grow in our giving. And I think that's an important thing too. Yeah.
I heard a speaker once talk about the like Old Testament and New Testament law differences and things like that. Like that's like always a hot button topic for people. Like, what do we do with the Old Testament law and stuff like that? And I appreciated the image he used for it, where he talks about how if you picture Jesus as a prism, that like the Old Testament law is refracted through Jesus. So the idea is like on the other side of Jesus, we see this much more beautiful refraction of still the same light, right? Like still the same thing. It just looks different on the other side of Jesus. And I think that's kind of what I hear you talking about when you talk about tithing, that it's like, yeah, we're not calling people to a 7-year cycle where years 2 and 5 you give to these people and all that, right? But that like on the other side of Jesus, that it's like posture, right? And that it's less about the specifics of it and more about like how we're living. And I think that kind of leads into the next question that I have, is this idea of I think when we talk about greed, it's very easy because it's money focused or like normally centers around money, it can be easy to talk about things that like are just problems for people with a lot of money, right? Or that like we jump to like, how do you ethically invest, or like how do you make sure greed, in those sort of things. What does a posture of generosity look like when scarcity is a reality for you?
I think then still, even when that scarcity is a reality, there should be some sacrificial giving of some sort, because I just think that otherwise greed still gets a hold of our hearts. That, as I said in the my definition, that it's wanting or desiring something too much. So it's the amount of wanting that you have, and you can have a little bit of money and be very, very greedy, or you could have a lot of money and be very greedy. It's not the amount of money you have, but the amount of wanting in your heart. And so I still think sacrificial giving is important, but what that might look like is just, it might look very different than for other people. It might look like, I still think percentages are a good way to think through giving, because they can kind of go across different places that people might be. So maybe for that, though, as I said on Sunday, maybe it's for you, if you're in that space, it's just starting at like 2%. So something, I like the idea of anything coming in, that some goes back out. I just think that's an important principle. That whatever we come in, some should go back out, and maybe start at like 2%. You just see where God goes with that. Some people who've been, as I said, even tithing for a while, they might need to be actually challenged to have more, to be even a more generous person out of that. And I just think that it's also important to be paying attention to the Holy Spirit's discernment in how and when and how much to give. I really just trust His guidance and leading for someone like that. Even in my story on Sunday with that guy with the Leafs, like Krista felt very, very strongly that she heard from God that she needed to say yes to that immediately and instantly, and she did. Right? I didn't really check in with what God was asking, and said it was just my kind of like that reaction. So I think that principle of paying attention and discerning and asking is the right thing. Because what it can look like in different lives can look very differently. And let's remember too, while we're talking about tithing or even giving, or primarily around money, that also does include even like John used the term like our talents, our time, and our treasures, right? Like we have skills we're called to give with this too. We're supposed to give up our time as well. I also just think though, you can't be a generous person if it doesn't infect your money or your use of money. So that both are, all three of those things are needed.
I think that's super good. And like, I think Andy Stanley talks about it in similar ways, where his whole thing is like the amount is for you to figure out. The act is an act of trust. It's an act of faith, and it's basically just saying like before. And he argues that like the Bible does with tithing, right? This idea of it being first, right? That like. And you talked about this on Sunday too, that being generous actually does affect you in practical ways too. And how you look at your finances changes when we're generous. And that like doing that first and having like leading with generosity when it comes to your finances is not just a smart biblical practice, it's just a smart financial practice as well, given what we know, what you're talking about generosity and how it changes us.
I think actually Andy Stanley has 3 P's, because he often does that kind of stuff. He has, I think it is priority, so you give first, that it's a percentage, like choose a percentage, and that's meant to be progressive, so you continually kind of grow that as the God kind of leads you. And I think those are good practical like little tips for how to,
3 P's, 3 T's. We got so many acronyms.
So many things all over the place.
Last question we had, this is another congregation submitted question. That is not about the practice of generosity, but the reception of generosity. Is what advice would you have to those who find it difficult to receive generosity?
I really resonate with that question, because I personally sometimes struggle with receiving. I think because then it means that I'm in need and I'm not in control or whatever else, and it's hard sometimes to say yes. So I definitely resonate with it. So if you're struggling with receiving, I think the biggest thing is probably just to learn to accept that and to just say thank you and to let that be, to just say thank you. And not to kind of overdo it or anything else, but to actually just learn to be able to receive and to say thank you. I think it's actually a good spiritual practice, especially if it's something that you struggle with. That probably means, like for me, that maybe there's some control stuff that's going on there below the surface or whatever else. But I'm not sure I have a great answer other than that, like, because I personally struggle with that a lot and with receiving.
Yeah.
I'm much more likely to want to give than to say, actually, I'm in need of help here. And oh my gosh, thank you so much for all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my own personal bet with it.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. Like I struggle to receive generosity as well. And there's, and specifically around help. And I have a hard time saying yes to help because again, like I don't want to admit any lack. Right.
Yeah.
I think the first thing and the biggest thing that I would say is just like, be curious about why that's difficult. That I think like being curious about why you feel things and some self-reflection will never be a bad practice. And like you're saying, like, is it because I feel like I have some sort of lack that I don't want to admit, and that like that's getting in the way of me asking or receiving help? Or is this, like we'll talk about this later in this series, but like, is this pride getting in the way of something that like God is trying to do in a way that God is trying to fill a need for me in this moment? I think two things. So the first is that receiving generosity, those sort of things can be just like practice makes perfect. Like oftentimes those things, for something to change, it has to change. So you just have to force yourself to receive it. And then on the other side, recognize that you're still alive and things are still okay and that you made it through okay. The second thing is that I think oftentimes our difficulty receiving generosity has more to do with a lie that we've been given from a culture that is very outcome oriented, that if we don't have everything that we need to do something, if we don't have all the finances we need, if we don't have all those things, that somehow that means we're not enough, or that somehow that requires shame or embarrassment or those sort of things. And I think that is super real and is really hard to push back against. But most of the time, the antidote to that kind of symptom is to, again, just do it.
Yeah. No, I really like that idea. It's to just kind of receive it. I remember when Krista had moved out. That sounds bad. But when she had moved out for school, I need to put on there for schooling for that year.
When she moved out for 9 months?
Yeah, when she moved out for 9 months. Was living in a different city for 9 months. That forced me to be in a posture of receiving because I knew I couldn't keep it all together.
Yeah.
There are people who were helping out by driving kids, or some people dropped off a meal for me, like once a week or something like that. And those things were hugely beneficial to me, but it was also hard to just learn to just say, in this season, I need to just accept it and to be grateful for it and to receive it. And that hopefully then when I'm in a different season, which we are in a different season now, obviously, because she's back and everything, but then we can do that for other people. And I think that is what church is meant to be about this giving and sharing and this generous living with one another. And that's an important thing for us to be keeping that gift reciprocally moving, that when we receive something, that then we also share something too. And that's an important part of, following Jesus and our own development.
Yeah, that is a wrap for today's episode. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. And we love having these conversations, but they are even better when you are a part of them. So if you have questions, thoughts, or topics that you would love to hear about, you could shoot us a text at the church phone number, which is 905-937-5300. You can also email communications@bethanyscc.ca, or honestly, find one of us, email one of us. It'll get to me eventually.
Yeah.
And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the BCC pod and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're enjoying the podcast, do us a favor and leave us a quick rating or review. It's a simple way to help others find us and be encouraged as well. That is all we have for today. So until next time, we will see you on Sunday and back here next week.
Yeah, sounds great.
See ya.